Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're unpacking a truly wild piece of history. We're looking at how a microscopic parasite literally redirected the course of a nation and shaped the geopolitical map we know today.
So, what if I told you that back in 1950, a massive military invasion, we're talking hundreds of thousands of troops, was completely stopped in its tracks by a 1-millimeter waterborne worm? I know, it sounds like something straight out of a sci-fi movie, right? But as we go through these historical and medical sources, you're going to see exactly how an invisible biological force halted a massive military machine.
Let's set the scene. It's late 1949. Following a really exhausting civil war, the Chinese Communist People's Liberation Army, or the PLA, is actively massing its forces near Shanghai. They were gearing up for a monumental amphibious assault, planning to capture the island of Taiwan and finally bring the conflict to a close.
Now, the PLA had actually just pulled off a successful capture of Hainan Island in the spring of 1950. But taking Taiwan was a completely different beast. See, getting to Hainan meant crossing just 15 miles of water, which the PLA managed to do using basic wooden boats under the cover of night. But Taiwan, that required crossing 100 miles of the open, notoriously choppy Formosa Strait. Plus, they'd be going up against nationalist forces and still had serious naval and aerial superiority. It was a massive tactical leap.
And here was the biggest logistical nightmare for the PLA. They completely lacked specialized amphibious landing craft. You know, the kind of boats that can drive right up onto a beach. Instead, they had to rely on traditional wooden junks. That meant these big boats would have to drop anchor offshore, and the soldiers would literally have to swim the rest of the way to the invasion beaches, fully loaded with gear while under active enemy fire.
So to prep for this unbelievably grueling task, military planners initiated massive swimming lessons. Tens of thousands of elite troops spent months training in the canals and coastal waters of the Yangtze River Delta, just trying to get ready for that final, deadly swim.
But, unbeknownst to the military planners, those training waters were hiding an invisible enemy. The rivers and canals were absolutely infested with freshwater snails, and these snails carried a blood fluke parasite called Schistosoma japonicum. As the soldiers swam day after day, these tiny, free-swimming parasites directly penetrated their skin, triggering an acute, devastating disease known as Katayama fever.
Suddenly, these troops were fighting a war going on inside their own bodies, and the clinical symptoms of Katayama fever were absolutely debilitating. We're talking about migrating parasites literally moving through their systems, causing intense nocturnal fevers that kept them up all night, severe urticarial skin rashes, sharp abdominal pain, coughing, and just total, overwhelming fatigue. It was a complete medical crisis.
And the sheer scale of this outbreak is kind of hard to wrap your head around. This wasn't just a handful of sick soldiers. At least 38% of the elite assault force was suddenly incapacitated. That's anywhere from 37,000 to 50,000 soldiers who were completely unable to fight. Overnight, the PLA essentially lost the equivalent of 3 full divisions.
The strain this put on their medical infrastructure was just massive. They had to rapidly pull over 1,200 medical personnel to the front lines just to triage and treat the sick. And because the main treatment at the time involved these really harsh, toxic antimony injections, recovery was agonizingly slow. The medical treatments dragged on for months, all the way into the end of April 1950.
To really grasp the severity of this, it helps to look at the Allied experience during World War II. During the invasion of the Philippines, Allied troops on Leyte, specifically groups like the Royal Australian Air Force's No. 3 Airfield Construction Squadron, contracted the exact same disease. All it took was swimming or building bridges in infected rivers, and boom, they were dealing with the same migrating parasites and brutal fevers.
Comparing these two historical medical outcomes is super fascinating. Both forces experienced massive infection rates, up to 40% in some specific Allied units and 38% for the PLA. But their medical realities couldn't have been more different. The Allies had the luxury of mass evacuating their infected troops all the way back to the US or Australia for proper treatment. The PLA? They didn't have that option at all, which meant desperate, frontline triage. For the Allies, it meant rotating a few units out of the theater, but for the PLA, the geopolitical impact was the indefinite delay of a national invasion.
And that strategic consequence is really the crux of the story. This outbreak acted as a totally unexpected biological deterrent. Because they lost so much elite manpower and had to completely divert their medical resources, the PLA was forced to delay their planned invasion of Taiwan by at least 6 crucial months. That 6-month delay triggered one of the most incredible historical butterfly effects of the 20th century. The invasion planning had started back in June 1949, but because of this parasite, their timeline got pushed right into June 1950. And what happens in June 1950? The completely unexpected outbreak of the Korean War.
The timing of that changed world history. In direct response to the situation in Korea, U.S. President Harry S. Truman ordered the 7th Fleet into the Taiwan Strait. The goal was to neutralize the area and stop the conflict from spreading. But the sudden arrival of American warships created an insurmountable military barrier. It permanently closed the PLA's window of opportunity, indefinitely thwarting their planned invasion.
Fast forward to today, the separation of Taiwan from the mainland. The separation that was essentially locked in by a microscopic fluke has evolved into one of the most complex, high-stakes geopolitical standoffs in the world. Obviously, today it's no longer governed by biological factors, but by the incredibly intricate nuances of modern crisis deterrence and deeply ingrained cultural misperceptions between global superpowers.
The sources we're analyzing make it really clear that a conventional invasion today remains an incredibly daunting task. Even with modern technology, pulling off an amphibious assault requires a massive sea lift capacity and rapid air superiority over that exact same 100-mile stretch of water. It leaves conventional forces highly vulnerable to asymmetric defense systems and deeply susceptible to diplomatic miscalculations.
Because of that, modern strategies have shifted way away from the idea of soldiers swimming onto beaches. Strategic analysis points to a heavy focus on asymmetric capabilities. Things like integrated missile systems, information dominance, and command and control warfare. The goal now is to degrade defensive capabilities without necessarily having to execute a traditional high-risk beach landing.
So, what do the 1950 parasite outbreak and today's intricate deterrence strategies have in common? Well, they both teach us exactly why this history matters. Warfare is subject to immense, totally unpredictable friction. It doesn't matter how meticulously a campaign is planned, unilateral actions are highly susceptible to catastrophic miscalculations, whether that disruption comes from a breakdown in digital information systems or a tiny waterborne snail.
I want to leave you with a final thought to mull over. In our era of highly advanced technology, hypersonic missiles, and artificial intelligence, what are the modern microscopic blind spots that could completely derail the carefully laid plans of today's military superpowers? It really makes you think about the limits of human control. Thanks for joining the Explainer today, and keep questioning what you see.